Thank you all for coming. It's an intimate group, so I can be informal. This is, as Emily has stated, my 9th book. The first that I've done that is not really entirely about one aspect or another of books and book culture. However, it did more or less start that way. I think I'll just briefly begin by saying that paper for many hundreds of years here in the West, and even longer in the Middle East, and even longer than that in Asia, has been the principal medium of transmission, the stuff of transmission. So if you've written about every aspect of books, as I've tried to do, the first book being A Gentle Madness, Bibliomania. Do note the subtitle, by the way, in red by a self-confessed bibliophiliac. That's an invented word. We credit my editor at Knopf, Vicki Wilson, with coming up with that. She said, "Are you a bibliomaniac or not, or a bibliophile?" I said, well, my wife would probably say I'm a maniac on the one hand, but I like to think I have it under control. So we came up with this one little phrase, and it really makes wonderful inscriptions, I have to say. I've been looking, I had a woman last night in Madison, Connecticut, who brought all 9 of my books to be inscribed, and we just met for the first time, and she wanted a different inscription for each book. You talk about running out of juice and ideas with one individual, but thank goodness I had the bibliophiliac to work with. I'm going to just kind of get right into the slides, and I'd like to give you just an idea in pictures what the book is about. It really is text. It has 18 chapters, 3 parts. There's no way I can hope to give you an overview of the whole book tonight, but I'd like to give you a sense of what I tried to do. Let me just say before I start that what really captured me, I did start to look at books and book culture and the stuff of transmission, but paper just overtook the whole project. It took 8 years. It's the longest at my age. Let me tell you, and I have a classmate here tonight. Pleasure to see you, Pat, here in the audience tonight. But for all the years I've been writing, next year I'll celebrate my 50th anniversary of getting my first paycheck from a newspaper, so it's been a long time. But I did spend 8 years on this book, longer than any previous book, and I have to say the subject just captured me. The whole idea of paper. We think of the great inventions of humanity, glass or steel or iron, the wheel. You can't really say where these things were invented or who invented them, but we do have a very precise idea where paper was invented, when it was invented, and who invented it. And we also have a very good idea of how it migrated about the globe over 1,500 years or so. The story of the migration and the impact it had everywhere it went just became a fascinating story for me, and that really explains why it took 8 years to get this thing in print. So I've asked people along the way, this little quiz here tonight, and I promise there won't be too many quizzes, but this is one. Can anybody tell me what this is? I'll give you 10 seconds. Give you 5. It's the Diamond Sutra. Now that happens to be the oldest printed book extant in the world. It predates the Gutenberg Bible by easily 500 years. It was printed in China in 868 AD on paper. Now what you're looking at are 2 of what the Chinese regard as their 4 outstanding inventions of antiquity. Paper being one, printing being the second. Of course, they did not print. Their invention was not with metal type as Gutenberg. His invention proceeded, but with carved wooden wood blocks. But there you see there was 5 large sheets of paper. It was printed. That's the frontispiece, and it, as we say, predates by 500 years. But you have paper and you have printing, so that really kind of started the whole thing for me. Now there are a couple pretty pictures in here, really, because they're pretty, but there's a reason. I'm the sort of journalist that has to go where the story is. I like to go where the wild goose goes, as the song, Frankie Lane's song, went. And if you're going to really study paper, where it originated, how it originated, you have to go to China. What you're looking at is the Salween River in Yunnan province. Those mountains in the background are the foothills of the Himalayas. The little road you see snaking off to the left is the old Burma Road. And in the fall of 2007, I joined a group of half a dozen paper historians, if you can believe it, who embarked on a 3-week trip to Yunnan and Sichuan provinces in China. Our goal to find, locate, interview, and see instances of paper making being done in pretty much precisely the same way as it has been done for 2,000 years, because there still are pockets and places in China and indeed in parts of the Far East where paper is still made in the very same ways. And by the way, this was also the region of China during World War II, if you're familiar with the old saying, flying the hump, where we supplied Chiang Kai-shek's forces from India. The airport they flew into was Kunming. That's where we started. So we were following the old Burma Road, but that's the old Burma Road, that's the new Burma Road. For one photograph that can show you, I think in one image, the new China and the old China. This one says it for me. You see the old Burma Road down there and the new one. That's a 3,000-mile expressway going from Beijing to Mumbai. And it's kind of a metaphor, really, for what's happening with the whole concept of paper making in that region of China. The gentleman in the lower left is Guan Kaiyun. He's a senior member of the China Academy of Sciences. He was our guide on this particular trip. He's also an internationally renowned botanist. He also wanted to see examples of paper being made in the original process. Paper, I should point out, as I said, it begins with an idea. What's one of the many things that's absolutely fascinating for me is that there was nothing inevitable about it. What the Chinese managed to unlock 2,000 years ago was this process by which you can take any form of vegetation. Paper is really a compound. You take any vegetative source, you pound it into a pulp, you suspend it in great volumes of water, and then you screen it through a sieve. The resulting layer, when it dries, is a sheet of paper. That's the way it was 2,000 years ago, and that is the way it remains today. I mean, you can see that flight of stairs off to the right. This was a place that I swear reminded me of James Hilton's Shangri-La. We were going up these 300 or so stairs to this paper studio. And why was this paper mill up in the mountain, and why were others down below? Because where the water is its purest is where you'll find these paper mills. So that's where we're going. But as you can see, also the old ways predominate in this part of the world. Now, this is one of the very first paper makers we met. These are all my photographs, by the way. This gentleman's family had been making paper in this village called Jade Spring outside of Tengchong, not far from the border with Burma, for over 600 years. We were told while we were there that another few weeks he'd be closing down, not for lack of business, but really his grandson, not his son, but his grandson, had been working out on the highway you just saw, was not interested in making paper, so they were closing it down. Now you see that's a very nice pose. He was wonderful. He didn't speak a word of English. That's some of his paper off to the left there. But really most of the work is done by his wife, who you see there. She was a paper maker. She seems to handle the business. That's one of our colleagues over there on the left taking a picture of her. That's his son up there. We bought samples everywhere we went. Handmade paper. This is paper made by the bast, the material that you find, you scoop out of the inner bark of the mulberry tree. The Chinese process for making paper began with, I maintain that it's the earliest known manufactured project that used recycled materials. You use the bast of the mulberry tree, but they also used old fish nets and frayed cordage from hemp ropes, and really it was a remarkable process. Here are some of the shoots of the mulberry trees, and that's another thing. You don't have to harvest the whole tree for the type of paper that they make. They just take the young shoots off the tree. They next year they grow new ones. It's brought in on, as you can see, by these young women in bundles on their backs, brought to a little mill like this. Now, one of the people I traveled with, this woman from Massachusetts who's been doing this for 40 years, her goal in life, her mission is to go out and document instances of hand paper making. When we arrived at this particular place, she shouted, "They're cooking, they're cooking, they're cooking." She'd been doing this for 40 years. She had never seen any examples of where they were doing any cooking. It's usually 2 or 3 days a month that they do it. If you catch it, it's very lucky. And by the way, these images of paper making that I'm showing you here in China, I could have put some old images, 200, 300, 400-year-old images of paper making in China. I chose to use the photographs because it hasn't changed. You know, here's some of that mulberry pulp being soaked, getting ready to be beaten. And here's, again, back at Jade Spring, one of two women who are working assiduously, forming sheets. And this is at another mill. A lot of this paper was made for spirit paper, which is, there are 1.3 billion people in China. Many millions of them still practice their Buddhist faith, and they use paper as offerings. And I think there's an image here that we'll show you later. And here's paper being brushed on, having been brushed on brick walls to dry in the sun. These are some paper makers taking a break. Everybody smokes that I noticed in China. And we bought, again, samples of paper everywhere we went. And here's some of the spirit paper that I was telling you about. Well, from the land of the mulberry paper, we went up to Sichuan, which is the home of the panda bear. This is the great inland bamboo sea, and the fiber of choice up there is bamboo. People think, they suggest, well, how come it took so long for we in the West to figure out how to extract usable fiber from trees? We weren't really able to do that until the 19th century, whereas the Chinese have been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, the bamboo is not a tree, it's a grass, and there are specific problems with the trees, particularly a compound known as the lignin, which had to be extracted, but bamboo is the fiber of choice up there. There's your bamboo again. And here's some paper making. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because there are a lot of slides here. Cigarettes again. This was exquisite calligraphic paper, huge, like 8 feet long sheets, made for, it's called Schwenza, and this was a really high quality type of paper. We bought some examples of this, very pristine white. Again, the difference between handmade paper and mechanical paper is that the fibers are spread randomly when you're doing it by hand, whereas in the modern machines it's kind of in a north-south orientation. You can tell instantly, and it's much stronger if it's made by hand because of the fiber, the way the fiber is dispersed about the screen. Brushing paper on metal plates, again drying. It was really fascinating, all this paper being hung out to dry. My editor, Vicki Wilson, loved this particular picture. She uses it as the frontispiece to part one, basically the frontispiece to the book. The woman's name, Xue Tao, you can see she's an 8th century woman. She is China's very first female paper maker. And she was also an accomplished poet of some note. That little image to the left is the spring where she made her paper. This is in the city of Chengdu. If you notice the hibiscus on her gown there, she used hibiscus flowers as what we call a formation aid in the making of her paper. There's no bleach back in these days, and so if you really wanted to whiten something, you had to put the fiber out in the sun, whiten it in the sun, or if you put any kind of plants in your mix, it would take on the coloration of whatever it was. The surviving examples of her paper have a very pink, reddish tinge, and that little hibiscus there is kind of a tribute to her. She was a courtesan. She was the favorite of this chieftain of this village, and she was very bright, very capable, and when he died, he left her sufficient funds to carry on, and she is revered. I don't know of many places where you'll see statues erected to paper makers, but there you have it in China. Well, I didn't travel all over the world for this book, but I did go to China and I did go to Japan. Now, this is Echizen City in Japan, northwest, 4 hours or so by train from Tokyo, on the Sea of Japan, facing Korea, where it is believed, where it is known, paper making, the craft of paper making. That's one of the great stories, again, the migration. The Chinese really regarded this as soon as they invented it. Paper is said to have been invented in China in 105 AD, that's the year they give you, by a man named Cai Lun, spelled now C-A-I-L-U-N, and that is really the year when this man who was in charge of making weapons and also tools presented at court a very carefully thought out paper on the making, instruction manual really for the making of paper. Really, it developed over several hundred years prior to that, but he's the first person to articulate it. But they kept this. It was in use almost instantly throughout China, and they really regarded it as a proprietary craft. 300 or 400 years. Finally, Buddhist monks carrying it from Korea brought it into Japan. In Japan, the Japanese have always had this capacity to take something invented or conceived of somewhere else and make it truly their own. And in Japan in particular, with paper, what we call washi, the word for handmade paper, also made from the inner bark of the paper mulberry tree. Paper really has been elevated and is still regarded today almost synonymous with spirituality. There's a well-known Canadian poet and paper maker by the name of Dorothy Field. She wrote a book, Paper and Threshold, and she talks about the use of paper as an expression of spirituality. This is in the same city, Echizen City, and this is the temple to Kawakami Gozen. Kami is the Japanese word for God and also for paper. Now, I don't know why that is, but she is said to have come to this village about 500 AD. She could see they needed some new way to make a living. The rice crops weren't doing so well, and according to legend, she taught the principles of papermaking. She is still revered today in this district as the goddess of papermaking. For 3 days every May, they take the effigy of this is at the base of a mountain, down from the mountain, and the litter I'm about to show you, she's carried around the town, the city, and everyone vies for her attention. But notice these sheets of handmade paper that are at the lintel there, at the entrance to the temple, and it's a little closer view of it. That's the litter that she's carried around, and that's the story in Japanese of how she arrived in Japan. But really the reason I went to Japan was not just to pay my respects to the goddess, but to spend a day with this gentleman, Ichibei Iwano the ninth. He is the 9th generation of his family to be a master papermaker. He is a living national treasure, has been designated a living national treasure papermaker, and his father, Ichibei Iwano the 8th, was Japan's first living national treasure papermaker. And by the way, the name Ichibei is not given to you at birth. It is only given to you when you agree to be a papermaker. So it may not even be your firstborn son, it may not even be your son, but it might be a nephew. His son, Junichi, who you see here working with him in the lower panel, has agreed to learn at his father's side. And when you think about making paper by hand, when I arrived, here he is coming out carrying his shoes. They had been in the water room. And what they are doing there in these images, they have this freshly cleaned bast, as I mentioned. It's the inner bark of the it's called kozo, the paper mulberry tree, and they're removing every little speck of bark so they can have a paper of extraordinary purity and whiteness. And the paper he makes is really regarded by many artists as the world standard. But again, most of the work is done by his wife, as you can see here. She's been working by his side for 50 years making paper. Here she is forming a sheet. I bought some of his paper. When I have an opportunity, I'm going to take one of those sheets of paper and frame it. I have nothing on it. It is such exquisite paper that it really deserves to be framed by itself. He also wanted to show me how strong his paper is. I went into the room. Here's a sheet. He told me, tear it. I didn't want to. I didn't think I could desecrate something so beautiful. But so he did it. But just look at that little fiber there on the right. Why one of the reasons why Japanese paper is so strong. And then he gave me this little piece of paper, The Joy of Living with Paper, which was kind of cool. Moving along, paper making past 751 AD, the Battle of Talas River, the Chinese Tang dynasty in a territorial war with the Abbasid Caliphate. The Arabs won that particular battle, and in exchange for their lives, some Chinese prisoners who were paper makers taught the craft to the Arabs, which for the next 500 or 600 years they were the center of paper making. This was at Samarkand in Central Asia, and what you see here, that's stamping the rags. Now the Arabs basically introduced the use of rags for their paper making. Cotton is the purest form of cellulose and still made, for centuries, has made the best paper, and it continues to be the best paper. And what you see there are pretty much the same basic steps that have been applied worldwide. It was another 500 years or so before the craft got into Europe. We'll get to that presently. But because of the arrival of paper making about 100 years after Muhammad, it was that particular example in the lower left is from the 10th century. It's a Quranic verse. On the right you see a a piece of paper from the 12th century. It's part of a world atlas. The Muslim scholars, of course, this was their golden age, and the immediate availability of paper is cited as one of the great reasons why they were able to do this. And these are other examples, wonderful examples of Arabic paper. This 11th century Quran at the Library of Congress. I like it. It's 11th century. It's North Africa. Because it's from North Africa, the paper then passes into Spain at the end of the 11th century, and from Spain it goes to Italy, and we start to have paper making in Europe. And here in 1390, this is from the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is published in 1493, but at the lower right and the inset at the upper left is the paper mill of Ullmann Stromer, the first paper mill north of the Alps, 1390. The year is so significant because just 60 years later, Gutenberg introduces printing by movable type. Would he have ever done that? Could he possibly have done that without paper? He did print some of his Bibles on parchment, which is made from the skin of goats, sheep rather. It is computed that for every Bible that he printed on parchment, he required the skins of 260 sheep. So I don't think so. It was a very costly process. Paper revolutionized everything and just made this whole explosion of print, which took place within 50 years. Millions of books were being printed all over Europe. I kind of go very quickly through the history of paper in Europe because it's been covered very well elsewhere, but I do use a lot of images. Those are stampers on the right to beat the rags to a pulp. The gentleman on the left was forming a sheet. This is various forms of paper making. Diderot's Encyclopedia. Lalande also had some examples. Stampers again. And then here's paper making in France in the 17th century. This is a very famous book, a man by the name of Jacob Christian Schaeffer. The search for a new fiber was relentless and unending because, as I said, rags were the primary source of material. And when you think of a manufactured process that requires the detritus of another manufactured process for its raw materials, it gets pretty tight. There were embargoes placed on the exportation of rags. It's been documented that in the early 1800s, in fact, some pretty savvy entrepreneurs imported from Egypt shiploads of Egyptian mummies so they could strip these mummies of their linen swathings to make paper out of it. And in one instance, it was said to have caused something of an outbreak of what they said was cholera. But Schaeffer experimented with over 80 different kinds of vegetable matter, and he made the paper himself. And I handled this particular set. These books are very scarce. This is considered the rarest book in the whole history of paper making. It's got a long German title. I have it in the book, but really it shows how important the search for a new fiber was. Well, these two broadsides are very interesting. They're both 1801. At left, Zenas Crane, the person who founded the Crane Paper Company, where I went, 7 generations of family ownership. Since 1879, been making all of the paper for American currency. I really go from one extreme to the other. I have a chapter that I call One and Done, which really talks about, shall we say, the hygienic uses of paper. And then I also talk about the going from that extreme to the other of paper as coin of the realm. You know, paper, it's a surrogate for our currency. But here's Zenas Crane opening his new mill in 1801, and he says, "Ladies, save your rags. You know, we will pay you good money for them. Please bring them to our agents." And over on the right, you see a man named Matthias Coops in England. He's looking for this is a long title, but really what this is, he's looking for subscribers to support a mill that he is setting up, and the type that you can't really see there, but it's printed on paper manufactured solely from straw. So that's the first time that had ever happened. I examined this book at the Houghton Library at Harvard. It is yellow like that, it has the color of the straw, but after 200 years opening it up, I have to tell you the aroma was wonderful. It was like fresh cut grass. It's fantastic. But here we are. When we talk about rags, of course, here's Harper's Weekly, 1870. These are the people who gathered the rags. So there's social and cultural applications. Here's another one from 1868, also Harper's Weekly. And then we go across the Hudson River here to New Jersey to the Markel plant. So this is kind of a consideration of all the different fibers that are used to make paper. This is the Markel plant, COW. Clean, office waste. So you see these blue bins in the office buildings of Manhattan. All that paper is going across the river to New Jersey and other places where they make 1 million rolls of toilet paper a day. I asked the fellow who showed me around, curbside is self-explanatory. I said, did you guys get the contract for the O.J. Simpson book? You remember a few years ago he came out with a book, If I Did It, or something like that, and the response was just overwhelming, and so they said, let's pulp it. That was HarperCollins, my old publisher. Not a good publishing decision there. But they had 400,000 copies of that book, and he said, well, we didn't get the contract for that. I said, well, how much toilet paper do you think it would have made? He said, oh, at least 1 million rolls. So if you're wondering what happened to that book, I think, it's had a pretty good ending. This is at the P.H. Glatfelter mill. I really went to 4 commercial mills. I wanted to see paper making done differently. The Crane mill I mentioned, they have not used a tree in over 200 years. It's a total tree-free process. 75% cotton, 25% flax. American currency really is 100% rag paper. This is the Glatfelter mill in Pennsylvania, where you literally see trees come in at one end, as you see the wood chips there, and you see paper being made inside and paper coming out the other. It's really a remarkable process. The Glatfelter company, I decided to use as a case study. This is an example of a company at a time when we talk about the paperless society, and there's a retraction of paper makers. I mean, there were 15 companies 15 years ago. It's down to 7. International Paper is now a $26 billion a year company, but they've absorbed 3 other companies. Glatfelter has gone from $500 million a year to $1.6 billion a year. It's a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not all that big. But what they did do and what they perceived, and when I say paper is ubiquitous, and when I say this whole concept of a paperless society is a myth, they tell you that they have 1,000 commercial uses for their paper. They make 85% of the paper used for tea bags. They make another 85% of the paper used for postage stamps. They make most of the paper for the Hallmark greeting card company. They make all the wrappers for the Reese's peanut butter cups. If you like Heineken or Carlsberg beer, those labels are Glatfelter paper. And if you have a copy of my book tonight, that's printed on Glatfelter paper. They make just about all of the paper for the publishing industry, and really all of the paper for the end sheets. A remarkable story, and they're very responsible. People ask me about the conservation and the pollution aspects. I touch on it lightly in this book, but this is one of the really responsible companies, as is Crane, and then as is Markel. I love this picture, these 3 pictures really. That's those pastel colored spools. Those are going off to the Hallmark greeting card company. They will be envelopes. On the lower right, if you look carefully, what you're looking at are Benjamin Franklin's watermarks zapping over my head. I just couldn't stop the camera down quickly enough. It's going at 60 miles an hour, but that's paper. You can see those vertical lines for currency, the security strips that are going in there. Here's some of the Franklin's being tested at a light for impurities. But again, going from various extremes of paper. All right, second quiz and the last quiz of the day. I asked you about the Diamond Sutra. Any guesses? Well, in my chapter, Rags to Riches, where it's really, we take rags literally, but really it's about the it's about the beginnings of the paper industry in North America in 1690, and how so very quickly paper became so essential to our daily lives. So much so that in 1765, the government in London enacted the Stamp Act. And what you are looking at here are stamps that were issued and paper made in London. They were cut and saved by a man named Jeremy Belknap at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Otherwise, most of these have disappeared. They were either destroyed or the pages were sent back to England to be repurposed. But I argue and I contend that really the run-up to the American Revolution really begins with resistance to the Stamp Act, which was entirely about paper. Every single one of the 55 or so clauses in that act is a tax on one use or another of paper, whether it's a deed to sell property, or whether it's for a marriage license or a license to be a lawyer. They decided that a very successful internal form of taxation would be to impose duties on the things that people required to conduct their daily lives, and which really required some form of legal mandate. It failed because, as Arthur Schlesinger Sr. has written, because they also chose to tax the newspapers. You never tax the newspapers. That was the fatal mistake, because it did get the enmity of the publishers. This is the Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser. If you notice, October 31st, 1765, Halloween. The next day, the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect, expiring in hopes of a resurrection to life again. William Bradford, there are 3 William Bradfords in this book. He stopped publishing the paper. He later joined the Continental Army, distinguished himself in the Revolution, retired as a colonel. This is called the Gunwad Bible. I have a section I call Fiery Consequences. I argue that warfare was changed dramatically by the implementation of the paper cartridge in the 17th century during the 30 Years' War. For 200 years, that was the way you loaded your muskets. It reduced the time of loading a single-shot musket from 42 steps down to 26. And in 1857, 250,000 or so sepoys, basically Muslim and Hindu troops in the employ, they were mercenaries for the British East India Company in India, refused to bite open the paper cartridges that had been issued to them for the new Enfield rifles, because they had been greased with tallow, which is derived from cows, which are sacred to Hindus, or lard, which is derived from pigs, which is repugnant to Muslims, and it sparked the insurrection, which really ultimately led to Indian independence. I'm looking for paper. I'm really looking for where paper is. You know, the Where's Waldo cartoons. Where does paper play its role in the American Revolution? Where does it play a role in warfare? The cultural applications. I also have a chapter on the renaissance of hand paper making skills here in the United States. I'm just really kind of going through some of these chapters very quickly to give you a sense of some of the themes of those. Are the Clarks, the Ma and Pa of the modern movement. 1971, they saw some desire to have wonderfully made handmade paper for artists, calligraphers, and they established this company called the Twin Rocker Handmade Paper Company out in Brookston, Indiana, on an old corn farm. I went out there, spent 2 days with them. Catherine made the paper. Howie made the machines, because it was a forgotten skill, a craft. The big mechanical, the huge forge grinder machines that I showed you earlier had replaced all the hand making machines. Well, that's a beater. And I said to Howie, how did you design these? There were no specs or anything. What was the degree of difficulty? He said, all I can tell you is that I have blood on every one of them. He made 50 of them for other people, and that's one of them right there. And here they are, making wonderful. I sent Catherine a copy of the book, and she sent me a note which I just received the other day on her paper. It's exquisite Twin Rocker paper, and there's their watermark there, and there's their paper maker. So I also have a section that I call Face Value, and I began it with the idea that I'd like to test the cliche that some things are not worth the paper they're printed on. And this is a $100 trillion Zimbabwean banknote that I bought on eBay for 50 cents, probably overpaid. But when you think of the intellectual construct, what's on this? Paper is the only material I maintain that has value strictly, wholly, and only by the intellectual construct that you put on it. In this case, the currency but it's made in beautiful paper, made in Germany. The same company that made paper for the Reichsmark during in the Weimar years in the 1920s. Here's a fellow papering his wall with them. Here's a woman fueling her stove. Here's some children playing with them. And then we also have ephemera, materials that are not meant to last the long haul, but become beautiful and collectible and important in their own right. This is a couple that saved 250,000 examples of ephemera, went to the Winterthur Museum. They did this over a period of 25 years, gathering on average 20 to 25 examples every day. It's an amazing collection. Tobacco, these are from the Arentz collection at the New York Public Library. I mentioned cigarettes. Directly emerged from the paper cartridge. And this is the $2 Million Club. That's the Honus Wagner card, a little piece of chromolithographed cardboard sold for $2 million. It's really valueless paper, but yet somebody is willing to pay $2 million for that baseball card. That's the Nicolas Cage copy of Superman, Action Comics #1. the debut of Superman. That recently sold for $2.1 million at auction, more than $21 million its original newsstand price in 1938, and it was printed on horrible paper. That's the Trey Skelling stamp from 1855, one of a kind. It's supposed to be green, it's yellow. The last time it was sold, it is said to have changed hands for about $5 million, something about the size of your thumb. This is the Basbanes book going up for sale here in New York in 2 weeks. It's said that it will sell for anywhere from $15 to $30 million for paper, right? And they're actually not in very good shape. So how many other objects that are manufactured can you say that about? And yet, even then, that's not the record. Here's a sheet of paper, head of a muse. Raphael sold for $48 million. It's a proprietary sketch for painting that's in the Vatican. I'll tell you briefly, this is Peter Drummey's favorite document of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Talk about paper and history as documents. This is a letter written by another William Bradford, the first governor of the Plymouth County, to John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it's a letter of some substance. What's very interesting about it, it's 52 years before the first paper mill was set up in America, but Winthrop's reply to Bradford is written on the same piece of paper. That is how scarce and how important and how dear paper was. And you're looking at history. Ken Rendell showed me this. He's a collector and a bookseller. He has an extraordinary museum of World War II artifacts. He took that document, as you can see, out of that safe, and he placed it in my hands. The writing in black, that's Adolf Hitler's handwriting. Over on the left, that's Neville Chamberlain. This is the draft copy of the Munich Agreement. He said, this is the document, you're holding the document that starts World War II. You're looking at the first printing of the Declaration of Independence. On those rare occasions that one comes up for sale, they can be expected to sell for $10 million. It's America's birth certificate. In one instant, with this printed document, we become a nation by this piece of paper. And it's not the one in the National Archives that is on parchment that is the first. That was done over a period of weeks after the first printed edition. That's a Folger Shakespeare Library copy of the first folio. I handle 6 of them. When they sell, they go for $10 or $12 million, a printed book. Briefly, world wonders that exist only on paper. The Parthenon as it existed before it was reduced largely to rubble by the Venetians in the 17th century, but Jacques Carré was sent there and he made these drawings. These are in the Bibliothèque Nationale. The same can be said for Old St. Paul's Cathedral. William Dugdale had the presence of mind to go out and document it, had Wenceslas Haller do these remarkable drawings. What that looked like, we have no idea other than their preservation on paper, but it led to the creation of the new St. Paul's Cathedral and the development of architecture. This is Sir Christopher Wren's Triumph, 35 years. That's what it looked like in 1848. These are the instruments from at Columbia University, the Andrew Alpern collection, instruments that really transfer from the mind's eye these flashes of inspiration onto paper. I really spend a lot of time on architecture and engineering blueprints. Is the Industrial Revolution possible without paper? Impossible. How could you possibly make a locomotive in various shops and make them come together precisely as planned if you didn't have very precise plans to work with? Growing up in Lowell, Massachusetts, these are documents that go back 200 years in beautiful Watman paper. The whole building of America's first industrial city is still preserved in the city where it was done with these remarkable drawings, engineering plans. What can I say about Leonardo da Vinci is that he thought on paper. He used paper as an instrument of his creative process. It's remarkable. I have a wonderful profile of Martin Kemp, who's handled all of these documents. I asked him, would it have been possible without paper? Impossible. The same can be said for Beethoven, and the same can be said for Thomas Edison, 3,500 notebooks. There's his sketch for the electric light bulb. That's a filament of paper, by the way, carbonized paper. And that's his phonograph, which used waxed paper the first time around. I have a whole section on bureaucracy. That's real red tape. They gave me some as a memento of my day. That's the Pentagon, 17 and a half square miles. It's here because Franklin Roosevelt, when he ushered its passage through Congress, he said, when this when this emergency is over, we're going to turn that building into a storage house for our National Archives, which already was filled to bursting. He had opened the first National Archives 6 years earlier. There are 80 billion pieces of paper. Talk about the paperless society preserved by the National Archives. I spent a day with the National Archivist of the United States, have a wonderful interview with him. Roosevelt was a bibliophile, a member of the Grolier Club here in New York, Baker Street Irregulars. He was proudest of what he did to preserve our papers, and he asked Felix Frankfurter, he said, if anyone wants to put up a memorial to me, just put a little thing about the size of my desk in memory of Franklin Roosevelt and put it in front of the National Archives, and that's where that is. One of many hundreds and hundreds of storage alcoves at the current National Archives, and we talk about bureaucracy. Pretty pictures taken on the vineyard, but again, it's paper lanterns, which suggests the first hot air balloon made by the Montgolfier brothers with paper from the family mill, carried the first humans aloft. These are paper balloons made by the Japanese during the latter months of World War II. 10,000 of them were made. 9,000 were launched in the jet stream. About 1,000 were believed to arrive in North America. 6 people died in Oregon, a woman and 5 children out for an outing. Believed that somebody was an unexploded bomb, and one of these, all made with handmade paper, by the way, each one having 600 sheets of handmade paper. The plaque there put up says that this is the only instance in World War II where civilians died from enemy action and it was the result of paper balloons. That's the real Tony Mendez. If you saw the movie Argo, I interviewed Tony years before Ben Affleck knew his name. When I contacted him, I told him what I was doing. I really wanted to write about paper, our documents. We are what our papers say we are. And he wrote back and he said, yeah, you want to talk to me. How I got in touch with him is an interesting story, but that'll wait for another time. He said, I'm a master forger, I'm a master counterfeiter. Yeah, you want to talk to me? And he told me all about the Argo operation. Thankfully, the stuff that's not in the movie, because they didn't consider the paper sexy enough, but he said we couldn't have done it without the paperwork. And he told me about a number of other operations which are equally as fascinating. Leading to the final sequence, here we are. And every book of mine starts with an image. This was the image. Seeing these geysers of paper spout into the air on that horrible morning. The only artifacts of any significance to survive that day are paper artifacts. When the new museum opens in the spring, it's really going to have overwhelming examples of paperwork. I thought, is any archaeological work being done with paper? This is Susan Mycelis, a wonderful photographer living here in Manhattan. I interviewed her for the book. She described the feeling of being there surrounded by all this paper. Here's a picture by Larry Towell. This man has to be in shock, probably not far from where we stand right now where this photograph was taken, but all this paper. So was it all mundane paper? Was it all legal pleadings? What was it? What was there? Did anyone do any work to preserve it? Were there pieces of significance that we can look at and say, this tells us something about the first year of the 21st century and what happened there at Ground Zero? And there were some pretty important pieces of paper that did survive. Here are papers being examined out of fresh kills. Quite a few of them went up to the New York State Museum, and others are going down here. This is the Pablo Ortiz card. Pablo Ortiz was a hero. He and another man, after the United Airlines 175 struck the South Tower, he could have escaped. He and this man, they got tools. They are later credited with having saved anywhere from 50 to 100 people to escape that day. They perished. That night, this business card came to rest on a windowsill in Brooklyn, and you can see the singes around. I get goose pimples when I think of it. And this next piece of paper, I was going to call this book Common Bond. For a variety of reasons, we changed the title, but I used it for the first chapter. But this is a piece of this common bond paper. 84th floor, West Office, 12 people trapped. The chain of custody is impeccable. A woman fleeing the scene picked it up. She looked at it. She walked to the Federal Reserve Bank, turned it over to a guard. He looked at it, and as he looked up, the building crumbled to the ground. Now, it's not signed. We don't know who that is. It's absolutely a plea for help, someone trying to help his colleagues, or her colleagues, as the case may be. When I went down there in 2009, when I saw this for the first time, and that's when the Federal Reserve had turned the document over to the museum, nobody had any idea who might have written this. How could they possibly? They knew Euro brokers were up there on the 84th floor. Maybe it was one of them. And I said, but what is that smudge over there on the left? And she said, well, we believe that to be blood. And so I said, is it possible to extract DNA from that? She said, we believe so, and we've talked to the medical examiner, and when she has time, because they have so many other thousands of fragments that they're dealing with, perhaps they will get to it. So when I was wrapping this book up about a year and a half ago, I called back. Lo and behold, they had made an identification. The woman who was the survivor of the man who wrote this letter, no question about it, she identified the handwriting. The DNA was a perfect match. They had already recovered some fragments of 30 fragments, so there's no question about whose smudge that was. She didn't want to talk about it, understandably. And I said, fine, then maybe it speaks for all of the victims that day. But a week or two later, the curator down there called me and she said, Denise Scott would be happy to talk to you. I went to visit her in Stamford, Connecticut. I've done thousands of interviews in my life. This, I have to say, was the hardest, the most difficult. She said, I have to say, I was secure in the knowledge. I believed that my husband died instantly because that was the epicenter of that strike. But then one of their 3 daughters said, Daddy must have been so scared. She said, no, your father was fighting to the end, and he was trying to help those people that mattered to him. So you talk about a piece of common bond paper saving its message over 10 years and then finally transferring it in ways that were unthought of hundreds of years ago when paper was invented, seemed to me to be a pretty nice coda and a decent way to end the book. And I thank you. I hope, sorry for going over my allotted time, but I've been trying to get it down to 45 minutes. Maybe I will. But thank you all for coming out tonight, and happy to answer any questions if you'd like, and also happy to sign any books. Okay.
Did anybody out there have any questions for Nick this evening?
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to ask you, what do you think will happen to the paper book in this digital age?
Well, I think there's a good future for paper. I mentioned parchment, and I mentioned papyrus. And papyrus and paper coexisted for 1,000 years. Do we have to have one medium to the exclusion of the other? I'm really worried about paper. What's the preservative medium going to be? Things that are born digital today. Are you confident that something on a 12-inch disc 20 years ago, how are you going to access it today? Or a 7-inch disc, or a 5-inch disc, or magnetic tape, which has degraded? The National Archivist told me still that the most secure medium of preservation is paper, and that when they actually have documents that are born digital, created digitally, if they're that important, they still make a paper copy for the archival copy. So I'm not ready to say that we are about to enter the realm of a paperless society. And what I failed to mention, there are 20,000 identifiable commercial uses for paper today. Not just books and newspapers, but 20,000 different ones, which also made it a compelling subject. You had a question?
Yeah, what's your given thought to your next work?
Say again?
Have you given thought?
I have, but I'm not ready to talk about it. But it's going to be a similar kind of, I hope, a similar kind of approach, but totally something else. We'll see. But my editor will be the first to know, and everybody else will be the next. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.